Good morning, everyone. My name is Kelsey Cannon. As introduced, I'm a senior research scientist at Lockheed Martin Space, and I work with David Harrison, who is the statistical engineering subject matter expert, also at Lockheed Martin Space. Many of you here from IDA, JUMP, maybe even NASA, that name David Harrison might sound familiar. But in any case, we've worked closely over the past few years to not only be knowledgeable and productive practitioners of the full gamut of stat techniques and uncertainty quantification principles in our day-to-day work, but also to figure out the best way to truly diffuse stat and UQ practices throughout the company. If I can draw on a few of the words of yesterday morning's speakers real quick who touched on some of these concepts, we had Lieutenant General retired Wendy Mazziello, who spoke on culture shift, on change management, and on adoption. There was Jill Marlowe, who discussed transformation, but on a comical point, she spoke on transforming the hot mess. And there was Ed, who sang more hilariously than I ever could, but it was about the data, about the people. So this presentation will really be on the people side of things and on our lessons learned throughout the process. So to begin with, the technical components of STAT and UQ are clearly accelerating very quickly. As customer wants have changed, as requirements have changed, and as the industry trajectory of accepting more risk when digitally allowable has also changed. So this really catalyzed the need to make both STAT and UQ processes the standard at Lockheed Martin. Going forward, just throughout this presentation, I'll set the foundation a little bit before touching on our initial communications plan, obtaining leader adoption, training engineers, and then we'll wrap that all up into how we'll use it going forward. I really need to stop doing this. I'm realizing it makes a noise. Okay, a little bit about the setting. Lockheed Martin is a huge company. There are 5 separate business areas, space company being one of them. There are approximately 20,000 employees in 2 primary locations, Denver, Colorado, and Sunnyvale, California. But that is amongst a whole slew of other locations. And then approximately half of those employees are engineers. The challenge that we were really faced with is that there's no specific area or no specific job code for statistical engineer. We have materials and RF and mechanical and software and cyber and planners and really the whole works. But all of those roles are spread out not only across geographic location, they're spread out across the entire company, across programs, across job titles. So identifying our correct audience is the bottom line of the challenge that we were facing. Our initial baby steps at overcoming that challenge is twofold. The first being becoming more engaged in programs that already had required and formal STAT oversight, MK21A and Space Fence. And the second being initiating an analytic test techniques community of practice where any interested attendees could gather and learn, bounce ideas off of each other, and really solve problems regardless of even what business area they were a part of, what level, geographic location, all those things that I just listed as limiting factors were thrown out the window. So initiating that community of practice led us into a bit of an exploration on change management. The graphic that you can see on the left I personally coined as the Valley of Emotional Death, just off of the play of our capability Valley of Death. But we're certainly, or I don't want to negate the optimism that change management has in getting everyone to fully traverse that change management curve all the way to the right-hand side, the point of enthusiasm. Something that we tried and did not work at all is that it turns out no one reads their emails. It was a hard one to swallow. So no one reads their emails, and even if, especially mass emails, then even if you do, very few act on them. So that approach just simply was not effective at all. Something that worked was initiating side campaigns to leaders. So David and I would pick an array of leaders throughout the company, and we would get their buy-in and their adoption first. We'd convince them of the effectiveness of both STAT and UQ processes. And then we would have these managers both identify and nominate the correct, their correct direct reports or the correct audience to undergo instructor-led training. Around the corner on the other side of this, that also had the effect of word of mouth. So it was really a twofold communications plan, but it turned out to be effective. And we have now trained a few hundred engineers, so that's a few hundred successive connections within Lockheed Martin Space, and a few hundred individuals of the ideal audience who now know about STAT and UQ processes. Throughout conducting some of those trainings, we learned a few things about engineers. The first being that most engineers have taken at most one statistics class, most likely none. Or there could have been like a statistical process unit inside of a different class. But regardless, depending on the length of someone's career and how frequently one might have been able to seek continuing education and things like that, it's entirely possible that that information could have been 10, 20, 30 years ago, or just maybe slightly outdated and due for a refresher. So the antidote to that was pretty simple. People were more than willing to be excited if David and I were excited, and to just really be excited about the STAT curriculum. The second point, and frustratingly, was that some view statistics as quote unquote soft or unnecessary, which we all know isn't true, but the antidote to that was really relying on the metrics. So showing these individuals who doubted the processes instances of time savings, of cost savings, of how it can streamline their work and make them a better engineer in their day-to-day life, really began that conversion process for their thinking. The third bullet point, in each training group, there were 1 to 2 what we called super users, which sounds great and is great, but had the collateral effect whenever we asked for feedback of some engineers citing the fact that they kind of felt like all bases were covered, and because this person in their group was really great at things, they didn't need to participate. So going forward from that, we did have to accept that not everyone can be fully converted, but we could use those super users as a socialization tool. So that essentially lends to the idea where person A is far more likely to be convinced and reach that point of enthusiasm on the change management curve if their manager tells them about something, or if their friend convinces them, than if I tell you, because it's my job to tell you. Last but not least, the last bullet point there is fragmented use. So on occasion, we did hear things along the lines of, if I would have known this yesterday, or if I would have known this a year ago, 5 years ago, 20 years ago, then that would have been great. And the antidote to that is simply engaging when the challenge arises. So whenever we were training engineers on STAT and UQ processes, we had no expectation that everybody was going to be a daily user of these processes. But at the very least, these individuals are now knowledgeable, they're prepared, or at a minimum, they know who to call whenever instances of implementation arise. So this segues us into a few different examples, the first being proposals. So let's think of a theoretical program manager and at the 30,000 foot level where they're going to be evaluating capabilities, managing people, managing a budget, most likely experiencing multiple different pressures from multiple different angles. So if we compact this all into one, and they're looking at a capability or a process, this program manager is going to be looking for credibility, proven ability, and then those instances of time and cost savings, how it keeps them on schedule and how it keeps them on budget, or better yet, makes it easier for them to do that. So when both STAT and UQ processes are required, that decision is automatically mandated for them, and there's sort of an automatic acceptance or acknowledgement of the government push to have a test architect or a STAT champion in place. However, when STAT and UQ are not required, then program managers need to feel like they are making a good decision, and that again is when we really need to be able to show that proven ability and have the metrics lined up to fulfill those 4 bullet points. Our second example is a little bit more of a collaborative one with Intopology, where Intopology's CEO became interested in STAT principles and specifically DOE concepts. So we conducted a training with their engineers. It was great. Everyone was excited. And then it resulted in some waiting and more waiting and more waiting. And about 6 months later, David and I learned 3 really critical things. The first being that Intopology engineers were able to persist through and solve some of their most sticky software problems. The second was that morale was high. So if we refer back to the good old valley of emotional death, they had reached probably around that hope, energy, and enthusiasm section, which is really the goal of this change management process. And the third being that STAT and UQ processes became ingrained into their best practices. Alrighty, so our next example in this collection is the classic one factor at a time, quote-unquote science project, where the team was highly frustrated. They were doing a lot of really exhaustive procedures and costly procedures, but through working with the STAT team, the work became streamlined, and we had an analytic framework in place that really provided them with hope moving forward. In terms of software and telemetry, this example was from an older IRAD that had never been solved. And by working with the STAT team for just 1 hour and really defining the scope of each of those parameters and understanding the factor interactions better, a rigorous and defensible test design was in place. And there are no doubts in my mind that that team, after all of their frustrating work and feeling like it, again, had, quote, never been solved, there are no doubts in my mind that they are in favor of having test architects in place. Thirdly, there's a group of model-based engineers who were doing some really great computer experiments and kriging studies, but there simply wasn't that test architect or the test designer in place to make connections where there really needed to be connections. Throughout working with the STAT team, a physical DOE was generated to close that gap, but this example stands in its place to really kind of show you how common and how unassuming a lot of these problems are within industry, and it speaks to a higher need for those test designers and having a STAT champion within every company, or as many as possible. So to begin to wrap up, Lockheed Martin Space was faced with a rather large challenge, and we had to put in some hard work and do some wiggling around to figure out what worked and what didn't work before gaining some ground and accumulating these instances of proven ability and of time and cost savings. If nothing else from this presentation, there are two main takeaways. The first being the creation of a communications plan in order to really obtain as many instances of adoption as possible, and to not negate that the people side of things is arguably just as important as the technical side of things. And secondly, to align with this large slant towards having test architects in place. And with that, I will open it for questions.
Any questions, please go to the microphone.
Hello, Chris Heineck from NASA. I was struck when you mentioned, nobody reads the mass emails, stuff like that, which I think is absolutely true. I was curious, though, not just but for general IT, we often have like some very specific technical details that we want people to like refer back to, like you need to go to this website to go unlock XYZ thing, or for the stats you need to use this algorithm, or something like that. What do you find is maybe the best way to communicate that so that they have it? The email, even if they don't read it, they can go search for it, or if there's a website, they can go look at it. But a lot of people don't look at the websites. So I don't know if you had some thoughts about those specific kind of details.
Absolutely. So I found that at least on a smaller scale, when it came to these training groups, or maybe just a handful of people, putting that, I'm not sure what system everybody works with, if it's like Outlook or putting that email in like 15 minutes on their calendar really fixed that problem. So there was time allotted for them to click on that link and to navigate through whatever resources they needed to navigate. At a larger scale, that's certainly a harder problem, and something that was partially solved with the training groups, where they had to be there, they had to be listening and engaged. But I don't have a specific answer when you're scaled up.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I enjoyed your presentation. My name is Terrell Hurst from Raytheon. And I'll really second your thing on the value of community of practice and really keeping the energy in that and getting people to come in and organize that. It's a chore on somebody's part to do that. It's
Absolutely.
usually not funded, but you just do that. But my question is, with regard to, does your organization provide funding for on-hours training, or is it all kind of after-hours training? We teach a lot of after-hours classes that really gets people engaged in STAT. I'm just curious your thoughts on hours versus off-hours training.
Excellent question. There is funding for on-hours training for that, which when you offer a charge number, it can be an incentive, naturally.
Yeah, hi. So there were some comments earlier about, dangers of people knowing just enough stat to be dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
But we see a good example here of where there was fairly light training, half-day training to people who probably already knew a decent amount, but it resulted in seemingly process improvements and morale improvement, which is great. So I guess the question is, where do you see really the value, and where do you go from here? Is it better to spread this training to even wider sets of your organization, or do you value deeper training for those who are already starting to get spun up on these things?
Great question. I think there's a lot of facets to that. So the bottom line of the challenge we were facing was identifying the quote-unquote correct audience. Which, if I were to summarize that into one sentence, it's people who conduct specific tests. So we really tried to have, again, the managers identify those people. But I don't think that there is a need or requirement to really disseminate it across, everybody who does testing. That would probably prove ineffective over time. I'm sorry, I'm trying to think back to the beginning of your question. There are so many parts. Thank you, sir. So having just enough information to be dangerous is dangerous. So as with everything it's a balance. So you get these people who are really, really knowledgeable and they're the true stat champions. And they can conduct all the trainings until the end of time across a wide audience, and people will know the basic framework, and they might be able to take those first steps. But the campaign that I'd like to draw your attention to now, that David and I worked on, was quote unquote the one call away campaign. So we instill the foundational principles, and these individuals who undergo the training can have a spark go off when an instance of implementation arises, and they might be able to take those first steps. But in general, if they, if their problem doesn't necessarily fit into the academic box that we so often speak of, if there's any kind of like a twist or a turn, then we are one call away. The stat champions are one call away. Thanks.
Final, a quick one. David Steinman, Industrial Sciences Group. We have similar issues at a different scale, but do you think in this communication culture thing, the word statistics, for some unknown reason, seems to be like poison? It seems to be a turn-off, whereas uncertainty quantification, as others, seems to be more acceptable. Engineers, like quantification and uncertainty. Do you think that's it comes down to that, the choice of words?
I don't know. As I mentioned previously, and again, frustratingly, I was surprised to hear that whenever we talked about statistics or even uncertainty quantification, then people are like, oh, I don't need that. Like, we need the hard sciences. It was surprising. And I don't think we've experienced the same thing with getting buy-in for UQ, but not for stat. They seem to be grouped together more or less for us. But in general, again, like relying on those metrics and showing them that how we're doing things, it works fine for now. But there's certainly room for improvement, and we can align with the industry trajectory by doing these other things. And turns out, here's all of these incentives to do so. This is how it'll make your job easier, and things like that really began the conversion process for those individuals. Thank you.
So I have a question for you. I really like the term test architect, and I'm curious, is that something you all came up with, or you found that somewhere? And how do you describe the role of a test architect when you use that word?
I don't think I can claim credit for that one. David Harrison can probably claim credit for that one. But in general, I kind of use test architect and test designer interchangeably. But their role is to really serve as the stat champion. Also is the third synonymous term that I'm going to loop into there. Regardless, the role is to look at an instance of implementation and to identify the factors and factor interactions that matter and those that don't, to do a lot of that analysis framework and to appropriately communicate to a testing team the results. And so generally that means that the test architect is going to be providing options. So they're going to say, this point might be your ideal run, but depending on what budget you have, you can go this route or take this separate pathway, and to really try to mitigate a lot of the factors at play to conform to some of the things that we need to work around within industry.
Any other questions?